Can I welcome you to the GLA Oversight Committee? If we can begin with the formal business of our agenda before we get to our main item of scrutiny for this meeting. Okay, so let's do apologies for absence and chair's announcements. I've got no announcements, but have you got any apologies?
I do. I have apologies from Assembly Member Arnold, Assembly Member Copley and Assembly Member O'Connell, for whom Assembly Member Devonish is substituting.
Thank you very much. Of course, I welcome our invited guests, Dr. Debbie Weeks-Bernard and officers, which I might ask you when we get to your item to introduce the officers for the members of the committee. Okay, can we move to declarations of interest? Can we note the list of officers held by Assembly members? And can I ask members if there are any disclosable pecuniary interest in specific items listed on the agenda?
Nope. No, Chairman.
Okay, I know Assembly Member Pidgeon.
I wanted to raise, under this item, it's not specifically about my own personal interest, but I wanted to raise a general issue about the GLA and how the GLA as a corporate body declares interests. I recently wrote to the Chief Officer and made a formal complaint about one of our executive directors who had signed off a loan to a developer of £22 million when this officer's home backs on to the site in question, and at no point in the whole process did this officer declare any interest whatsoever. I think this is a really serious concern. I raised it with the Chief Officer. Her response was it's a personal matter. I don't think it is when you look at the Nolan principles of governance. And at a recent meeting of the Garden Bridge Working Group, I actually raised this issue with Transport for London with Mike Brown to suss out how another part of the GLA group would deal with this matter. And I talked about whether if somebody had a property interest and they perhaps backed onto a project, whether they would be part of that decision. And he made it very clear. In fact, he said absolutely, definitely not. And he cited the only example of Wimbledon, where he lives, and Crossrail 2 decisions. He would not sign off any decision. So it seems to me that there are issues here across the GLA in terms of how officers think it's appropriate to declare interests. And I kind of would like a review of the whole interest process across the GLA group for best practice, but how City Hall operates. And linked to that, it's also declaring gifts and hospitalities, because this particular director had not declared any hospitality or gifts for many, many months. Yet if you looked over the years, he would regularly have dinners and the like with developers and others. And I think that's fine as long as it's properly declared. But similarly, I was looking earlier, the mayor hasn't declared for a number of months any gifts and hospitality. I find that surprising, given, again, his interests normally show that when visitors come, he might receive gifts and so on. And I think we need to make sure that we have proper process in this place. And later on this agenda, in the draft annual governance statement, it says we have a sound system of governance. I'm not sure we do. If officers at the top of this organisation don't think it's appropriate to declare an interest when they back onto a site that's going to gain money and be developed, it just doesn't feel right to me, and we should be an exemplar in this area. And I would like a piece of work to be done on this, and also linked to it is all these sort of committees and other bodies that sort of exist within the GLA, which aren't really out there. There are different committees that meet within here that lead to the decisions that we end up receiving, which are published online, which show 3 pages of decision for £50-odd million worth of loans or whatever it is. I think we really need to get behind some of that, because I think officers at every stage need to be declaring interest and even removing themselves so that they cannot be put in this position where they are conflicted. So I think it's a big piece of work for this committee, Chair.
Look, there are two issues there, and I think on the first issue about the declarations, I question whether it's a personal matter, to be honest, for particular officers. I think there's some discretionary points, but there are rules laid down, and for those following the webcast, we have very severe rules for politicians, and we should have very similar rules, and I do believe there are for chief officers of this authority and of the GLA family. So let's deal with that, because it's a serious matter that you've done. We're asked the Head of Paid Service to produce a report for our next meeting. I think it would be appropriate that we put, maybe in a redacted form of names, but we should share your exchange of correspondence with the Head of Paid Service and the response back. And you're right, it would be a good time to remind all parts of this organisation, whether it's the Mayor, the Mayor's team, Assembly members, Chief Officers, and their responsibilities about declarations. No one wishes to close down activities, but there does need to be a degree of transparency, particularly if they potentially are related to decisions for members of the public to either follow up or even colleagues to raise issues and matters. Now, on the second point, I think it's very important you raised about the highways and byways of the small groupings that take decisions, sometimes on delegated authority, sometimes in referring issues up to the Mayor. And we certainly, I understand the Secretariat are producing a piece of work. It might well be the Head of Paid Service, so Secretariat at the same service, and we should receive a report back about how best that we deal with some of those bodies. It might be appropriate as the Scrutiny Committee should be aware and starts asking questions, but I think we should be very clear about whether we want access to the information, or at least agenda items and all issues like that. So the report that we should get back, one, is identifying what are these officer bodies that exist. Two, what should be our stance towards them in requesting information around scrutiny of activities. And I think that will open up an interesting debate about not just for the remainder of this administration, but for the next administration, to think about how it wants to go about and carry out its scrutiny of those actions. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great. And looking at the gifts and hospitalities as well.
Definitely looking at that.
Across the board, there are lots of people clearly not declaring anything.
Yeah, well, we just need to look at that again and see what's going on. Okay,
Thank you, Chair.
Can we move on then? In terms of that, item 3, standing delegations. Can we note the standing delegations the Chair has set out in the agenda, which was agreed at the London Assembly plenary meeting on the 6th of June 2019? Agreed. For the minutes, can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting on the 15th of May 2019 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
5 summary list, agenda item 5, summary list of actions. Can we note the completed and outstanding actions arising from the previous meetings of the GLA Oversight Committee?
Agreed.
And then can we come to item 6, which is our first, is our main piece of business at today's meeting, which is the Mayor's annual equality report for 2018 and 19. And can I reiterate my welcome to Dr. Debbie Weeks-Bernard, Deputy Mayor for Social Integration, Social Mobility and Community Engagement, along with your officer team. Now, I've explained to our members that much that you're overseeing this work, there are some detailed questions that maybe you might not be able to answer it, you might be able to answer it. We're quite relaxed about getting written answers on some of those issues, and we may reserve the right to call some of your colleagues appropriate to those areas back before this committee if we feel there's a further questioning about their remit in terms of their contribution to this quality report. Do you want to do an opening statement, and do you want to introduce the officers that you've brought with us?
I'll certainly do that. So I'd like to introduce the officers who are sat with me. This is Alice Wilcox. She leads our Team London and sports team. And this is Kathleen Kelly and Jeanette Bain-Burnett, who are my ADs for Communities and Social Policy.
Okay. Is there anything you want to do by way of an introduction, or should we go straight into some questions?
I wondered if I could just make a brief opening statement just to provide some context for the report for members. Can I just start by saying thank you, Chair, and to Assembly members for inviting me to come along to talk about the Mayor's Annual Equality Report. I'm going to call it the Equality Report because it's a bit of a mouthful when I refer to it. I wanted to provide just a little bit of context for the report itself, because it's linked very clearly to aspects of my remit, which are to promote social integration, social mobility and community engagement. So the Annual Equality Report is our first opportunity to really measure progress against 39 objectives which were set out in the Equality diversity and inclusion strategy, which the Mayor launched last May, we have responsibility for working with strategic leads across various teams in the GLA and the GLA functional bodies to ensure that they are monitoring their progress in relation to those 39 objectives. And my equality and fairness team are those who have that responsibility for setting up regular meetings with those strategic leads so that they can take responsibility for monitoring their own progress against those objectives and indeed the indicators that sit just beneath them. The Equality and Fairness team is one of 5 teams that sit within my remit. The additional teams that I have responsibility for are Team London and Community Sport, and I've already introduced Alice, who has responsibility for leading those teams, but also social integration and community engagement, which sit within the responsibilities for Jeanette and Kathleen. And I just wanted to say, I think by way of explanation for the way in which we conduct our the way that we collect information for the content of that report, just 3 aspects of the way that we do so, as this is relevant both to the way that we have collected the content for the report, but also the work that we do generally, which is to promote equality, to assist the Mayor in creating a city which is fairer and more equal, but also one in which people from a range of different backgrounds can make more meaningful connections with each other to try to bridge some of those divides and those tensions, which can often lead to hate crime and a variety of other different tensions in society. So there are 3 main approaches that we take, and the first, which is incredibly important, I think, for our discussion today, is mainstreaming. We think it's incredibly important that if we are to make any real tangible impacts in the lives of those individuals who are experiencing barriers to progress or to really take advantage of all of the benefits that London has to offer, that every group within the GLA and the GLA functional bodies take some responsibility for promoting equality. So the responsibility for promoting equality doesn't sit exclusively with myself and with my team. We work with other teams to ensure that they are helping the Mayor to meet his duties under the Equality Act, and I think that's massively important if we're to try to make any real difference in trying to reduce those equality gaps which we know exist for many vulnerable groups in society. The second approach, which is also is important to this discussion, is that the Mayor has gone further than just simply meeting his duty under the Equality Act. In addition to supporting and promoting equality for those who come from the 9 protected characteristics that the equality legislation protects, we also have included to that list of individuals those who we think experience real vulnerabilities in society. So these individuals include single parents, young people who are in care, young people who are care leavers, refugees and migrants, but also those on low incomes and those in low socioeconomic groups, because our equality legislation doesn't include a focus on those who come from low socioeconomic groups. And we also recognise that those who come from those additional groups that I've mentioned also experience some real challenges that we feel that we have some responsibility to try to do our best to support and to tackle. And finally, the other distinctive approach that we take is to work very closely with civil society and the charitable sector. Before I came to this role, I started this role in November, I spent the majority of my professional career working in the charitable sector, either in small third sector organisations or in foundations which gave support to charities to do really important work. And the reason that I mention civil society organisations is because we know that in times of real financial stress or austerity, often those civil society organisations pick up the slack in relation to the gaps which are left in some of our essential public services, which many vulnerable groups rely on. So we take our responsibility to both support and to champion those who work in civil society, supporting them in capacity building where possible, championing the work that they do, but also, once I took up the role in November, I recruited 18 experts from a range of different backgrounds, representing those from grassroots organisations who come from across those 9 protected characteristics, but also those who support young people and those who come from low-income groups. And we've done that principally so that we can bring the voices of those sectors who are doing that really important work on the ground, but also to make sure that everything that we do across the GLA, all the decisions that we make, all the interventions that we come up with are actually really meeting the needs of those individuals. So I just wanted to provide a bit of context for the work that we do. There are a range of other responsibilities that I have which sits under my portfolio. I do have an incredibly long title, but all of the elements of the work in that title are all equally as important as each other. And I'd be really happy to take any questions on any elements of my other responsibilities and indeed on the report itself.
I think we concentrate on the report today, and I think we might bring you back and talk about your other aspects of your work. If I can kick off, generally, look, this committee is not you. I don't want you to think it's you. I don't want to think it's this piece of work. There seems to be a problem in terms of the Mayor's office around some of the issues around specific measurable targets and, well, it is that. Specific measurable targets, how can we demonstrate that we're succeeding and in addressing an issue? I think there's a lot of work that's gone into this report. And if I can just add to that, and just add there, so how does the Mayor or a reader of this report determine whether you're actually getting on top of this if there's no performance targets set out in the departments? So can we just have your initial comments on that?
Thank you, and that's it's a really important question. I certainly do agree that when it comes to trying to make a difference in the lives of those individuals who are really struggling in society, that we have to show that we're actually making a difference to their lives. And the best way to do that is to show how we are progressing in reducing any of the gaps that they're experiencing. The annual equality report is the attempt by all of the GLA bodies and teams across the GLA to meet their progress against the 39 objectives that we set out in the strategy. The strategy has those 39 objectives, and underneath each of those objectives are a set of indicators which we feel fully represent some of the areas which sit underneath those objectives. So if we look at some of the chapters which are included within the Mayor's Equality Report, when we think about whether or not London is a good place to live, we include indicators which focus on housing affordability, on homelessness, on rough sleeping, and then beneath all of those indicators then have an equality issue attached to them. So if there are groups of individuals who we know are really suffering in relation to homelessness or in relation to being unable to afford housing in the city, we will ensure that those equality groups are then attached to those indicators so that those in the housing team can more adequately measure how they are really achieving progress against those indicators. It's also important to state that the objectives themselves are ones that we derived and developed in conjunction and consultation with lots of experts across London, from those from civil society organisations that I've mentioned, but also in association with the GLA City Intelligence Unit. So we know that these are objectives which should fully really capture the sorts of experiences that we want Londoners to be able to have positively. And if there are groups that we feel are not having such a positive experience of London across those objectives, then we've listed indicators and groups, equality groups, that we feel that those teams should be paying due regard to and monitoring their progress in relation to.
And I just suppose I should have started with this question, really. And you covered it briefly in your opening statement. So in terms of key achievements, what would you highlight from this particular report? And what are the key messages that we should take from this plan?
So there are a number of key achievements. I think one of the biggest ones for me is that we've been able to have each of the teams across the GLA conduct their own equality work, and that for me is really important. I come from a sector in which it was often difficult to get people to take equality seriously, and I think it's actually really important and something to celebrate that we've got teams across the GLA who are monitoring equality themselves. Yes, we support them in as much as we can. We develop action plans with them. We help them to think about best ways to monitor it. But ultimately, it is the responsibility of the housing team, the planning team, of MOPAC to monitor their own progress. So that, for me, is a really big achievement. And I think I was really heartened when I came to the GLA to see that that was happening. I also think the achievements that we've been able to outline in relation to housing are worth noting. I've I've come from a sector in which the main aim was to tackle poverty, and in London, some of the biggest drivers for poverty are high housing costs. So I'm really enthused to see that the Mayor has developed his affordable housing scheme, which really importantly is trying to bring down the cost of housing, trying to address bringing down the cost of living more widely for many groups. So the work that we are doing in relation to education and skills is also incredibly important, because it's enabling those who are on some of the lowest paid jobs in our city to access some of the skills that they need to be able to progress out of low pay, to move out of poverty, to move out of financial hardship. So those are some of the things that I think we've done really well on, and I'm really heartened to see that there are teams across the GLA who've been doing this work really well.
Okay. And I just suppose, lastly, I suppose more about presentational issues about this report. Do you think, just a reflection on the messages that comes out, can we, you know, I suppose it's about a personal preference, but can we be clearer about those messages in future presentations of them, about the issues that we're trying to get across? But equally, can in future reports support the areas of additional funding allocations with actual amounts spent, so we can see between investment versus outcomes? If anything, just reading the overall report, there's lots about inputs. Yeah. It's the outputs, I think, the bits that was missing for me. Yeah. So how do we address that sort of presentational issue in those last set of questions?
So I think that's a really good suggestion.
Yeah.
I know that in comparison to, well, I can only speak in relation to my team, but I know certainly in comparison to many of the other teams that exist across the GLA, the funds that we have at our disposal to really take action on tackling inequality are much smaller in comparison to some of the other teams. But I think that it would be actually quite important for us to talk about how much we've invested as a way of measuring progress. And I think that it's an important one to take away. I think it's something that we could look at for future reports. I think it's important, I suppose, to note that this is the very first occasion that we've had to measure progress against those objectives. So it's a learning document. It's something that we've developed. We want to put it out there and see how people respond to it. And if you feel that we should be adding in information about expenditure in relation to seeing how much they're spending and how much we can show progress, then I think we'd be very happy to do that.
Thank you. Let's move on then to the next set of questions. Assembly Member Shaw.
Thank you, Chair. My questions are on this section about Great Place to Live, which in the main covers housing, infrastructure, social infrastructure, and issues like air quality. Now, the report, I think quite rightly says that there's a great progress in terms of additional funding, which is in the region of 1.67 billion to deliver additional affordable home starts, etc. But obviously what we don't have, going back to Chair's point, in terms of actual outcomes at annual level, which I understand it's challenging, but something, which we need to have, because looking at the reg ratings, both on housing affordability, accessible housing, which is about adaptability as well as wheelchair access, the ratings are very low. So obviously there is a problem there. So can you tell us what are the key indicators that London is improving as a great place to live generally, despite what I've just indicated? What's your take on that?
Okay, so thank you for your question, Navin. There are a number of indicators which sit within this particular chapter, and they range, as you've rightly noted, from housing affordability to accessibility to homelessness and rough sleeping. I'd like to focus just on two of those, if I may, as some of the detail on some of the others. It may be necessary for me to go back to James Murray and his team to seek some of that detail to the question, which I can do so in writing if you'd be agreeable. But I'd like to focus initially on housing affordability, but also on rough sleeping, because these are two areas, or one of those are areas where our teams have actually worked quite closely with James Murray and his team, and can talk a little bit about some of the progress that we've made in respect of that. In relation to rough sleeping, I know that the report outlines that there's been a 25% increase in the numbers who are rough sleeping, and we know that there is quite a significant proportion of those who are of that group who are non-UK nationals, and indeed those who are from Central and Eastern Europe. We have supported James Murray and his team quite specifically in trying to advocate on behalf of those specific groups of individuals, because we know that if they were to have access to proper legal advice, but also to have access to welfare support, which many are denied because they're not eligible for welfare support, that would help to move them off the streets into more secure tenancies, into work, and reduce those rough sleeping figures. So we've worked quite closely with James and his team in providing him with some of the advice and support that he needs to ensure that we can continue to advocate on behalf of those groups of individuals. We've also done quite a bit of work through our teams on the EU Londoners Hub, which many of you may be aware of, in which we've been supporting the 1 million EU nationals who are seeking to regularise their status. What we've done in addition to that hub is we have provided some micro grants to organisations who work with some of the most vulnerable EU nationals, particularly Roma communities, and those for whom English is a challenge, but also for those for whom, because of the nature of their English skills, digital access is also a challenge, and also for those for whom there is a real lack of trust in the government, so who would be less likely to want to put themselves forward in order to regularise their status, because we recognise that if we do not do all we can to work with those groups of individuals, that we will be contributing to a larger pool of individuals who will ultimately become insecure, will have insecure status should they not apply by the time of the deadline. And the reason that I raise this is because those individuals that I've mentioned have a greater risk of being homeless, and indeed many of them are homeless. And we have been supporting the Roma support group, who've been working very closely with Roma communities who are on the streets, supporting them to recognise that they do need to think about regularising their status, but also helping to bring them into the fold, as it were, so that they can do all they can to try to support bringing them off the streets. And if I turn to housing affordability, we know that in the report we noted that there's been an increase in the numbers of people who are spending up to a third of their income on housing. And we know that certainly in London that the amount spent on housing can really exacerbate your risk of falling into poverty. And we know that the sorts of individuals who fall within this group tend to be people in the private rented sector, also minority ethnic individuals, but also those who are in the lowest fifth of the income distribution, so those who are on some of the very lowest incomes in our city. And the Mayor is doing all he can to try to address at least the bringing down of the housing cost, as I've mentioned, because housing cost is a real exacerbator of poverty risk. And so he's gone to the government, he's asked for more funding, he's used £1 billion of that funding to work with local authorities so that they can increase the building of council homes, which is one of the first times that we've done something of that scale at City Hall, which is incredibly important. And all of this work is necessary to try to make a difference where we can in trying to reduce the numbers of individuals who are very vulnerable to financial hardship, vulnerable to poverty, but also vulnerable to destitution. And so we're trying to do all we can to try to support those groups. In relation to the accessibility point, though, I would be very happy to go to James Murray and his team and get a more detailed answer to your question and come back to you in writing.
Can you also come back and something very much like you to bear in mind and have part as your key achievements or targets kind of, and that is something which doesn't appear here, and I'm not surprised. Talk about specialist housing for older people, you mentioned affordability, etc. but something which, in a sense, is backward step, in my view, in terms of mere strategy, which is reflected in New London Plan, and that is lack of emphasis on family-sized dwellings. This is something I'd like, I suppose, through your housing colleagues, very strictly monitor what is happening London-wide, because certainly out in London boroughs, etc., there's glut of smaller units, but as far as family-sized dwellings are concerned, it is an issue and something which London Plan, the New London Plan, does not kind of give a priority that it should be given. Something I'd like you to look at. In terms of social infrastructure, because yes, I mean, we have a housing crisis, there's all this funding, lots of units being built, high densities, etc. But with that, again, key area to monitor and deliver is social infrastructure, i.e. what goes together with housing, you know, the medical, the education facilities, etc., etc. And there is that objective, I think it's number 8 within this section, and that needs to be very critically and carefully monitored and see what targets you come up with. Moving on to...
Can I just interrupt you just before you do your next one, because I think it's related to this answer to this question.
Yeah, morning, Debbie. You mentioned a statistic there, and I'm sorry, I think I'm a bit deaf, but it was about the number of Londoners now paying more than a third on their rent. Can you just go through that bit again?
Yeah, so in the Mayor's Annual Equality Report, we noted that there's been an increase in the number of those who are spending more than a third of their income on housing. And that has, I think this is the first increase that we've seen in the past 3 years.
Do you know what the figures, any figures?
I don't know the exact figures, no.
Just the reason I'm got rather surprised, and I think loads of people will be surprised it's just a third. I mean, no, most people, aren't they, spending like half their income? I know I am.
The figure is more than a third.
More than a third.
Yeah, we're kind of capturing anything that's more than a third. So there's been an increase of people who are spending more than a third of
I
their
see.
income.
So, and you don't have figures, sorry, or you?
No, I don't have figures in relation to that, but I think your point is really important. I think what it speaks to is the fact that we've got increasing numbers of people who are working in this city in jobs which are very low paid or that are insecure, and so the amount that they're bringing into their homes in terms of household income is lower than they used to be, and it's also the amount that they're bringing in terms of wages isn't rising in line with inflation, and so the cost of living, the cost of housing takes up a greater amount of their household incomes. So I think that that statistic, which doesn't have the figures, I apologise, 33%, thank you so much, it's 33%, it actually reflects that the increasing numbers of people who are in low paid and insecure work in our city.
Thank you.
Yeah, on the strategy itself on inclusion, what can realistically be achieved over the 4 year of equality and diversity strategy to improve housing affordability, which you've been talking about London-wide?
Sorry, could you repeat your question? Sorry.
But basically, I mean, over a 4 year period, what can be achieved in terms of the broad strategy on both inclusion and equality?
In relation to housing?
Yeah.
Okay, so it might be useful to talk about some of the projects that we are running in relation to trying to improve the way that people, residents, individuals who are living in an area, the amount that they can have a say in regeneration projects, estate generation projects, planning, and all the sorts of things which impact directly on their experience of living in an area. And so very recently we've been running something called the Social Integration Design Lab. We're working with 17 authorities across London, and the work that they are doing is principally about trying to make sure that they are designing spaces which are more inclusive, which can promote social integration, which can do, just by the way in which they're designed, a job of work in trying to reduce inequalities for the individuals that live there. I know that there's been a lot of discussion in the past about some of the estate regeneration projects where you have poor doors, for example, or estates where you have certain facilities which are for wealthier homeowners in comparison to those who are in council social housing. And what we are trying to do with our social integration design lab is to work directly with local authorities so that they can increase the liaison that they have with their residents and those who work as well in the areas, to make sure that the future plans that they have for regeneration in an area properly takes into consideration the views of those individuals. And some of those 17 projects are about estate regeneration, so they're working quite closely with residents who want to have more of a say in the way in which their estates are designed or are regenerated. But also in respect of your question, the Mayor recently launched the London Housing Panel, and that London Housing Panel is made up of 15 representatives from voluntary and community sector organisations. And what's important about that is that they have the opportunity to really oversee the development of housing policy going forward. And I think it's really important that we have that partnership working with those individuals who've got the real, not just lived experience, but the real access to the concerns that ordinary Londoners have about housing policy going forward.
You mentioned in your earlier commentary estate regeneration. Yeah. And on that, what has the impact been of the new funding condition for GLA-funded estate regeneration projects to address the objective of better protecting Londoners living in social housing?
So thank you so much for that question. So this, again, is a detailed answer that I'm afraid, unfortunately, I can't necessarily give. I'd be really happy, though, to ask James to come, James Murray or his team to come to answer that. I think part of the way in which I think we can try to do better in relation to the way that we work with residents, with local individuals, is to try to do some of that work that I've mentioned before, where we're trying to change the way that we design spaces, to work more closely with those who have a responsibility for creating those spaces which will provide better opportunities for people to mix, to get together, but also to reduce some of those inequalities between different groups. But I'd be very happy to ask James to come to answer that question.
Thank you. Last question on this one is to do with air quality. Of course, the Mayor has recently introduced ULEZ.
Yes, yes.
With that, there's also issue about scrappage scheme.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Can you tell us how much of the ULEZ scrappage scheme has been actually used in, well, the take-up aspect? Yep. Yeah.
So I know that the low-income scrappage scheme has not yet been launched, and that's going to be launched later on this year. The low-income, the way in which we've been defined...
Huge increase when I think, what was it? It's supposed to be about 500 staff when this place was set up.
So I think it's probably worth saying that that's the number of headcount in terms of 1,043. And as you say, it's up significantly and a 15% increase. I think it's also worth being clear that the total number of established posts is, in terms of those that are fixed term and permanent, is actually higher at 1,305, which is the number of posts which we are going to fill, paragraph 5.3, which is, again, an increase on last year. Exactly. So to answer your question, what I think I'm trying to say is that the number is going to increase over time, just so we're really clear about the headcount and the number of posts. I think you asked me what's going on and why there are so many. Yes, we have had significant growth in the skills sector, given that the devolved functions have come through. We have seen a growth in DEE with the new sector policies and objective development, enterprise and environment. And we have seen, as is set out in the budget, 98, that the number of established posts also includes 98 posts that were agreed in the 1920 budget.
Okay. Just seems huge. I understand when we have new areas come in, but it does seem a very big jump in staff in the last few years, particularly, and I just am not clear, really not clear what the new jobs are that have been created.
Assembly Member Devonish.
Mary, when you increase staff numbers the way you have, I think the issue almost brings me back to friends of mine in the House of Commons after MPs' expenses. The public don't follow these things as closely as we do, but at some stage they turn around and say, are you having a laugh? Can you really justify these huge increases? We're 8-9 years into what many people call austerity. Lots of our parts of the public sector have got shortages of people, and I think the average Londoner would say the NHS perhaps needs more resources, our frontline schools need resources, our frontline police need resources, but I won't repeat the whole argument there, that's a mayoral question. But when you actually, if you are trying to talk to either major stakeholders that you engage with, be it the business community, the media, or just normal Londoners, can you really justify this? What do you say to people on the famous Clapham omnibus?
I mean, I want to make the point that the ones I am responsible for to date are the ones in the last 6 months, and I take responsibility for the creation of those jobs. 99 of them were laid out in the budget, which went through all the normal process as the 99 permanent jobs. Most of those are in housing and land, related to significant sums of money that the GLA has secured from government to create jobs, to create new homes. So, 50% of that 99 are for that. I have created 55 fixed-term posts in the 6 months since I've been here, and I've laid those out for the committee, so you can see exactly which posts those are. Those haven't previously been laid out in that way, and I'll continue to do that. And I do feel I can justify those 55, given that the funding is there and programmes are there to be delivered. That's the justification. None of these jobs have increased the budget as agreed back in October with the Budget and Performance Committee. The money is there for these jobs, the work is there, and I've therefore created them.
Time, I'll leave it at that, Chair.
Okay, any further questions? Well, can I just say one? In terms of the breakdown between men earning over 90,000 and women, I think it's something like your figure is 66% of men and 34% of women earning over 90,000. Clearly, giving the mayoral policies and where we are, I'm not in terms of, I'm all for supporting the best person for the job. That can't be right, can it? So what's the strategies for dealing with that next time? Just remind this committee. Are we going to see, or do we think that gap is acceptable?
As set out, I think at paragraph 10.3, we are, and as actually my colleague Debbie said before, there is a whole set of work around our gender pay gap and our ethnicity pay gap. We're striving for equality on both of those, and we are scoping work to also take that further to review whether there is potential for a disability pay gap. We've published data and action plans that go along with all of those analyses. I think it also it lends itself to a real spotlight on how we're attracting the most diverse talent. And you'll see it, the paragraphs that we set out under recruitment, that some of our candidate pools are now more diverse than ever, particularly around BME staff and women, and that some of that is being converted into shortlist and appointments. So it's about equality in the most broadest sense, and how we both attract new talent and how we promote talent internally.
Okay. Are there any further questions from the committee? Can we then note this report? Let's move on to item 8, updating changes of the regrading policy. Can we do the same as before? Are there any questions from members? I think this is an ongoing issue which is being reported back to us. There are no questions. Can we note the proposals for the operations of job evaluation panels and the reporting of regrades going forward? Okay, agreed? Okay, tell me to slow down if you want me to slow down. True,
You're doing a great job, Chair.
Okay, 9, conversions fixed term post to permanent post. The Chief Officer referred to this earlier. Is there anything you need to tell us? No, it's a yes or no.
Just very briefly, I said I would do a review of this.
Yeah.
That review is now complete. So I already consulted you on 24. This is the remaining 30. We won't be doing any more conversions like this. If there are any more to come, they'll come through the next budget process. But this is the end of the review. And I really think having gone with the first 24, we need to go with these 30 because the criteria are identical across the set.
Okay, it all seems from our earlier conversations at previous committees, this is common sense and makes some sense. Can we note this report in going forward and the proposals within it?
Noted.
Okay, let's move on to 10. Proposed restructure of corporate management. I should say that Gareth, who can't be here, has been doing some work with Mary, more detailed work than maybe we would do at committee level. Do we wish to take an introduction to this report, or are we ready to raise some questions?
Questions, I think.
Okay, agreed. Okay, so questions, right. Are questions open to members? Are there any questions? Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you. On the gender pay gap, that's here, isn't it? The interesting thing is that one of our sister bodies, the London Fire Brigade, apparently has no gender pay gap.
Sorry.
Am I on the wrong one?
Yeah, we're moving on to...
10.
This is on, item 10, proposed restructure of corporate management.
I've turned my page over.
But fine.
Do you mind, can I ask it? Yeah, do you mind?
Very quickly,
Yeah,
just
very
to do it,
quick.
because I think we just deal with gender pay gap. It's quite an important issue.
Yeah.
And just, plonk
Very
it in.
quick, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so, yeah, the LFB have got no gender pay gap, allegedly. So how come they can achieve it and we can't?
I'm not the HR director for the London Fire Brigade, but the makeup of their workforce is very different to ours. Their pay and grading is different to ours. Their dispersion of men and women across the grades is different to us. I'm very happy to come back and speaking to colleagues at London Fire Brigade on the detail of
Yeah,
that.
perhaps you could have a word with them and see what they're doing right and we're doing wrong. Great, yeah, thank you.
Okay, let's go
Appreciate
back
that.
to item 10, proposed restructuring of corporate management. Assembly Member Berry.
To Mary, thank you for the note you sent around before as well, saying how you'd responded to feedback from members of this committee about the housing and land restructuring process. I mean, just in brief, this was being concerned that the homelessness services, the ones for more vulnerable lenders, were being moved out of housing and land and into communities, and that housing and land was essentially going to be a house building team. Now, we put representations in, and you say now that you're going to keep it in the same directorate, the homelessness and housing programs team, I think it's called, and there will be a dotted management line between the head of that team and the assistant director for communities and social policy, communities and skills. Can you explain a bit more about how that will work, and will that change how the team operates? Will they have new metrics? How will they be having two bosses help?
So I will explain it. The first thing I think is important to say that was an idea that came from the team themselves, the housing team, because I think what everybody did recognise, and this was a common theme across the consultations that I did, that the GLA still works too much in sort of directorate silos. There's some very, very good integrated working going on, but I think there could be a lot more. And there was a recognition of that. So although the housing team didn't want to move out of housing and land, I think they did recognise, as other teams did, that there's more that they could do to work across the boundaries. So the idea is that the head of that housing programmes and services team, you said, has a dotted... stays principally part of the housing and land team, but has a dotted line report into the other directorate to make sure that that team does some explicit work in a structured way to collaborate more. I didn't want to leave that to chance. I think there was a recognition that more can be done across the teams, and putting a dotted line in will mean that the head of the Housing Programmes and Services team has some objectives set from the other report, and actually spends some time in the senior leadership team of the other directorate as well. And I think all concerned think that that will help drive more collaborative working. But as I've said, we're going to look at it again at the end of the financial year and step back and say, okay, has that made the difference that I was looking for?
When it comes to our scrutiny, say the Housing Committee, we'd still call in the Executive Director for Housing and Land to answer our questions on that team's work. They wouldn't be saying, no, I can't answer those questions.
No.
Great, okay, thank you.
If they do, tell me.
Caroline Pidgey.
Can I just ask about the admin support to the directors, executive directors? Why are you creating one permanent and then one fixed term executive assistant, and then you're creating an admin role which is a role for career development, and then you're deleting some others? What's the thinking of what will the structure be, and why is one fixed term? That doesn't make sense to me when we were looking earlier at moving people away from that.
Yeah. So one is fixed. I'll cut those. In fact, what I should have said when we were talking about the fixed term paper is that we are taking great care going forward that we only create fixed term posts that are truly fixed term. I should have said that. There is quite a lot of work that we're doing at the moment related particularly to my transformation programme, but also to some of the work to get the corporate management team and the senior management team truly operating as a sort of collective at the top of the staffing body. That means there is more administrative support needed over the next sort of 12 to 18 months than we will need in sort of steady state. So that is the idea behind creating a fixed term admin person, and it's properly is a fixed term post. The corporate management team support that I inherited had a sort of a relatively senior head of office, and then a couple of executive assistants, and then a couple of junior assistants. And what we're moving to now is more of a model, much a flatter structure, where we have 3 executive assistants who are going to support 2 executive directors each, and then a sort of a trainee role, really, where we can have somebody sitting in the team who aspires to be an executive assistant, but is given some support to develop into that role. So it's a bit of a different structure.
Why do you need that role, that grade 4 role?
Well, we need it to support the capacity of the team, and there's a lot of running around, meeting and greeting people in that role. There's a lot of administrative tasks, some of which can be taken on by somebody without the experience required to be a senior executive assistant. It seemed to us at the corporate management team that we should be building in career development into the admin role, which we haven't really had before. And it also seemed to us we should be able to accept an a junior role or even a senior apprenticeship role into the team to model that for the rest of the organisation.
Thank you.
Any further questions? I think even though Gareth's not here, I feel there are a couple of things that he wanted to raise, and I'm not fully au fait because I've been out because of ailments and whatever. So my understanding is, and I think we should just record him for the record, he has some reservations around the fire, the Deputy Chair Fire's proposals in here. So he has reservations around that. In your conversations with him, were there other reservations? They weren't major reservations, but they were just concerns.
No, that was on this paper.
Yeah,
that was his only outstanding
That was
reservation.
the only outstanding one. There wasn't anything about the fixed term issue?
No.
Okay, fine. I think we should record that then, because he's done that piece of work and he's gone through it. And we should note this report. There's no other issues of major concern that we're going to raise as a committee.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. We're now moving on to item 11, proposed changes to GLA expenses and benefits frameworks. We've got Lead Officer Tom Middleton, Head of Finance and Governance, to answer our questions. This seems fairly straightforward. Can we... Oh, it's not straightforward. Caroline Pigeon.
I have a question on it, page 146 of our papers, party conferences. In this it says the Mayor recognises the party political aspect of attending conferences and decided the cost of attending the conference of his own political party will not fall on the GLA's budget. And it does show in the Mayor's Gifts and Hospitality Register that accommodation is passed or gifted by the Labour Party in any case. What about, how does this apply for GLA staff that accompany the Mayor to his own party conference?
Chair, I know this particular arrangement dates back some time and it applies to the party groups as well. I've not looked at it in detail recently, but I can happily get back to you on that.
But how would it apply to staff in your new framework you've set out here?
This part hasn't changed at all, but
Part hasn't changed.
it applies to party groups as well. I know it's a subject, the Chair will probably recall, subject to many long discussions over many years in terms of how this was brokered.
So at the moment, I believe that it's if members of staff attend party conference in support of politicians, they have to make political groups. They have to make a contribution of 50%.
Right.
It's 50%.
Would that
And
apply for the mayoral
changed.
staff?
And that applies to mayoral staff as well.
I will double check that, but I
Okay,
believe it.
I
I
just
believe
wanted-
it does.
Okay.
I will
That's
double
fine,
check
thank
that
you.
point.
Well, it should do. And if it hasn't, then there's a problem.
Yeah.
It depends exactly what you mean by mayoral staff, but I will get you a definitive answer.
Well, any staff he takes with him to party conference of his own party, and obviously Ken certainly used to come around all of our conferences, but
Yeah, I mean, this,
times have changed.
they have. There's the mayor's direct appointees, but there's also corporate officers like government relations. But I'll
Government
get,
relations is different. I'm talking about the core staff. Thank you.
Okay, so can we agree that?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, let's move on to item 12, draft annual governance statement. I've not had the, I'm a bit remiss here. I've not read this. Tom Middleton's probably very happy that I've not read this statement.
can I just...
But I can see a number of other people wishing to contribute to it.
Can I make just two very quick updates
Okay.
before we get into the questions? One was at this very meeting, so Caroline's point earlier, so we will amend the text to reflect the review that will be starting shortly around declarations of interest, so that text will change as of the interests and the gifts and hospitality as of today. The second update is since this statement was drafted, there's a further monitoring officer decision on the website, which we will update the text for that. So you members will be aware that they all go straight on the website. So there's 3 in the period that we're talking about rather than 2. So we'll update that as well.
Ah, good. Right, so let's go with Assembly Member Devenish first, and I'll bring in Assembly Member Pidgey.
Thank you. I'm not sure who I'm asking this to, but could you please advise me, one of the actions for next year is a review of the monitoring officer role. Now, next year, we all know, is an election year, so I don't want to be cynical about this, but why are you reviewing this role? Is it good practice to review a role that's all about good practice? Can you explain me what the review's about? Who's going to answer that?
I'm going to answer that because
Thank you.
actually it's some unfinished business from when I came to you in April with my corporate management team restructure, which obviously we've just now concluded that discussion. And I said I was keen to review the monitoring officer role on a number of fronts. And that was driven really by my observations of the role here. I did commit to engage the Assembly in that, of course, but haven't done much more work on that yet. I've been prioritising the corporate management team restructure. It's not next year I was planning to do it, it was this year. But it was issues around, at the moment our monitoring officer doesn't have a deputy, formally. The monitoring officer doesn't have any dedicated administrative support. Here, we don't insist that the monitoring officer is legally qualified. I am used to environments where the monitoring officer, members have requested that monitoring officer is legally qualified. Those were the issues that I was really putting out in the paper in April, and I now need to get that piece of work done.
We're not concerned in a very heightened year. This will be the most political year, let's be blunt, most of us have probably ever known. There's an election coming up for us. There's other elections possibly on a national stage, I hope not. Do you think this is good timing?
Well, it might not be good timing to make a whole raft of radical changes. I agree. But what I'd like to do is continue the discussion and then talk about, one, if they're going to happen, and two, what the timing might be if they are. Okay,
I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Just on a point of detail, because this is written in perspective of last financial year, next year is this year, if that makes any sense to anyone.
Yes.
Okay, Assembly Member Pidgeon and Assembly Member Prince.
Right, I wanted to pick up a few things here. So in terms of the description of Range's review of effectiveness, it sets out there about monitoring officer investigating various alleged breaches of the Code of Conduct. It doesn't mention anywhere that the chief officer received a complaint about an executive director, which I would have thought might be picked up because that was to do with, you know, the Nolan principles. In fact, I quoted them in my letter, and I wonder why that's not been picked up, because that's a serious complaint. And I'm wondering whether, and it was my advice, I thought I shouldn't take it to the monitoring officer, it should go to the chief officer, and I felt that might be something that should be picked up. There are some things in here that I don't really understand what they are, and it may be that you'll need to write and explain it and maybe part of this bigger piece of work. But you've got in here new sections explaining the difference between GLA managed and arm's length companies, a new section covering decision-making in respect to the two recently acquired arm's length companies, SME Wholesale Finance Limited and London Treasury Limited. Are you able to explain what these are, what the purpose of us acquiring them is, and give us a bit more detail on that? And then these are all on top of page 184. And then part G there, you say there's a new section setting out arrangements for decision-making in respect of the Homes for Londoners Land Fund, which is obviously the fund and the decision that I've made a formal complaint about. But on that decision form, and in fact on all the decision-making forms, there is no section for declaring interest. I'd have thought that would be quite a proper way forward. I'm wondering if that can be picked up not only in declaring any interest on the particular item, but also if any interests have been declared at any of the bodies that the final decision has emerged from. And I did read in this paper as well, one more point, that we have a sound system of governance. I think given what we have discussed earlier today and the reviews of setting up, you might want to revise that wording, because I'm not sure I would call the GLA having a sound system of governance. It clearly needs improvement in some areas.
Okay, thank you for that. To answer each of the points in turn, as I said at the outset, more than happy to incorporate the details you raised at the beginning of this meeting. So we will include that, including your complaint. I'll need to liaise with Mary as to exactly where that complaint stands, but we can certainly reference it. In terms of the companies, yes, I am quite familiar with both those situations. It might be easier if I write on both of those rather than try and say they're both quite technical in nature. As it'd be better to write with it rather than try and say it off the cuff, because they are both quite technical areas. Obviously our accounts, because they're wholly owned by the GLA, our accounts pick up both those entities. So that'd probably be easier if I write to the committee on that one. In terms of the third point you raised around the Homes for Londoners, etc., the arrangement, if someone feels they need to, through the normal decision-making process, declare an interest within a decision form, the options available tend to be either they recuse themselves from that particular decision, in which case their name wouldn't be on it at all, or they could record in the decision that they've considered the matter in hand, decided they don't have a conflict of interest, or they can just say nothing on the basis they don't think there's an issue at all. So they're the options that tend to be open to people. So
there's no space on the form.
Well, if someone decides there's no interest at all and there's nothing to say, if they want to write something in that they've considered and don't think there's one, it can just be written into the form.
Surely best practice would be for them to show that they have thought it through and decided, I don't have an interest in this. It's actually really trying to prompt people to think and to act properly.
Without preempting the review that you've suggested, that could well be one of the things that review looks at. It would seem sensible to me as a sensible development if there are concerns around the robustness and the comprehensiveness of this sort of declaration, then that could certainly be tackled. It wouldn't be difficult to include that at all. So that seems like a good idea to me. On the fourth point about governance, I mean, both our sets of auditors are complementary about our governance. If as you've said earlier, you have concerns, it's right that they're looked at. I just don't think we should preempt the outcome of those of that review and any other reviews. So if the review finds there are gaps in certain areas, documents like the AGS should definitely reflect that, and the auditors would reflect that in their opinions. So you're probably familiar that every year we get an internal audit opinion and an external audit opinion. Peter will know from chairing the audit panel. And if the sort of concerns you've described are something worth factoring into their opinions, then that would certainly be done. So it's not sort of self-declaration. The head of internal audit opines, the district auditor opines, based as independent people based on the information in front of them. So that's not something that I would personally get involved in.
Look, I think we want to follow some of these reviews back, and we need to think about how we include this back to this committee. It does beg the question, your earlier contribution, the contribution you just made, if Assembly Member Pidgeon hadn't raised it in this forum, would you have included the issue of the complaint? And if that's not the case, because you're not cited by it, then that suggests there's a problem with our governance arrangements. That's not saying that the people involved in exchanging the communication have done anything wrong. It's just there's a problem. It's about we've had this little exchange over a number of years, haven't we?
Yeah.
In previous administrations.
Absolutely.
About what should be recorded and what shouldn't be recorded. And we shouldn't be beating ourselves over the head. It should be an honest statement. I'm not saying you're dishonest, but an honest statement of what has taken place and how robust is our response back to it.
I completely agree, Chair, and the answer to your question is we would of course record it. Yeah. The reason we hadn't recorded it at the stage this particular document was written, which was towards the end of May this year, was I wasn't entirely sure where we'd got to with that. Okay. We had until the end of July. No one's hiding anything. I mean, this whole meeting's in the public domain, review and so forth. We're certainly not hiding anything. I just wasn't certain that we'd got to a point with that complaint that it was clear what we would say. Yeah, okay. Now, clearly, we will say something because it's been raised in public and there'll be a review. So, that is absolutely out there, and will be the next version you see will absolutely have that.
I'm assured. Assembly Member Prince, you wanted to come in.
I think it's been covered actually by Assembly Member, well, both Caroline and
Well, should we note your comments to us then as a committee and the changes you propose to make?
Yeah.
We'll follow up on the various bits and pieces in the review. We look forward to seeing the revised report. When's that revised report going to?
So it has to be signed off by the end of July. But of course, we can make sure that you see a final draft.
Yeah, with the bits in yellow where you've made changes highlighted in yellow.
Very happy to do that, and you'll be aware that it needs to be signed off by the Mayor and also by Mary.
If you could send that
We've
round.
got time. It's only the 1st of July.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, if we could send it round, it'd be great. So we can just see what you've included.
Yeah, no, that's no problem at all.
Okay, Mayor, moving on to item 13. That's my drugs that I've taken. Item 13, mayoral decision making in the GLA and GLA financial regulations. Again, we've got Tom to answer any questions. Are there any questions from members? Can I ask us to note the revisions made in the mayoral decision making in GLA and GLA financial regulations? Agreed? Item 14, London Assembly Work Programme. Our lead officer is Anastasia Balakova. I always do not do your name justice.
Please do not
I
worry, Chair.
apologise for that.
I can't either.
I also understand there's been some late changes made by on Regeneration Committee,
Correct.
which has been agreed by the members concerned. So I think we should note that. Are there any questions you wish to raise about the Assembly work programme?
Can we just check that lead members, not just the chair and deputy chair, need to be involved in agreeing the work programme forward? I'm not convinced that's happening on every committee. I just want to make sure that chairs are properly, with their support staff, consulting group leads. They may have done for the next couple because they had to have it signed off for this report, but there isn't, like, for me, an agreed year programme for all the committees. So could we make sure that sort of inclusive work programme is developed that members are happy with?
We'll put a reminder around and make sure that's happening. I know the late ones might have
that's
avoided
fine.
that.
I'm just thinking, this is the 3 months,
Okay.
but actually the year ahead, it's important that everyone's signed up to it.
Okay, we'll do that. Okay, can we agree that? Thank you. Moving on to item 15, work programme for the GLA Oversight. We can have discussions offline if there's any issues. Can I ask committee members to note the work programme for 2019 and 20? Date of the next meeting. Our next scheduled meeting is held on Tuesday 16th of July at 10 a.m. in Committee Room 5. Can you note that? There is being no any other urgent business. I conclude this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Well done.
Good. No, thank you.